Pacific Rim. It may not be the absolute best movie in the world, but I think it is my favourite. It's the film that made me realise I was a mecha fan, that got me to watch so many great anime as a result. So I was really happy at the announcement of a new Pacific Rim action figure line. But this figure, that should, one would think, be their flagship, unfortunately has just been a massive disappointment. Lingjihun's Crimson Typhoon, I was really quite happy with. I thought it was really quite a good figure. However, this Gypsy Danger has a lot wrong with it. Most immediately, obviously, it has the same paint problem as the Crimson Typhoon, where it's just too bright and too clean. This is just too light of a shade of blue for the Gypsy Danger, and so much shinier and more obviously metallic than the Jaeger ever was in the movie, or even in their own promotional images. And once you start to look closer, you can see that they've even put less effort into the details. The Crimson Typhoon was entirely panel lined, but this barely has any paint applied to the panel lines. You can see most clearly on the chest and shoulders that there has been some paint applied, but when you move lower to the abdomen, the waist, the thighs, it looks a lot more bare and lacking. And overall, I feel actually makes the sculpt look fairly soft. But it's not just the panel lines, there's just less weathering and dry brushing all around. In fact, I would initially have thought that there was none. But there is some on the figure if you look closely enough. There's absolutely none on the back. The Crimson Typhoon was similar. It had a much plainer back with much less effort and detail and less dry brushing and weathering and everything. But it wasn't none like this. In fairness though, they have still painted the gold details on the back. It would look significantly worse without them. Frankly, I feel like they had to paint the gold on the back like this. It would have been just too bad if they didn't. But you can still see just how much unpainted detail there is. Or, well, not entirely unpainted, but undetail painted detail. Most obviously, the back of the thighs, the back of the hips, where you can see some piston detail in the sculpt, but it's just being completely unpainted, unlike the front. I didn't mind the back being more unpainted on the Crimson Typhoon, and if that was the only issue, I wouldn't mind it on this either. It feels like just kind of a smart efficiency to make, but it's hard to argue that all of that detail on the back wouldn't look infinitely better with just the barest minimum of dry brushing. And it's not just the back. The front, where there is detail in that dark silver, suffers similarly. Most clearly on the shoulders. The top of the shoulders looks like kind of venting, like radiator, and would really benefit from, even honestly, ideally, just this tiny amount of silver dry brushing that's on the rest of the figure, as well as more fine detail on the outer part of the shoulder armour, where they've only painted a little bit of gold, but it would look a lot better with more variation. But probably most of all is the front of the shoulders, where you can even quite clearly see paint bleed from the blue, where it hasn't been masked or something properly in the factory, and so the blues bled through onto the dark silver where it shouldn't be. But, of course, there is still a lot of detail to praise. The sculpt itself does have a good amount of detail and panel lines and everything. You can see in comparison to the NECA Ultimate figure that, for example, on the chest, the kind of lower pec, it was completely smooth on the NECA, but this Lingjihun adds not only a lot of panel lines, but also rivets, raised panels, and decals. You can see similar on the sides of the thighs, where on the NECA it was just completely smooth all the way around pretty much, except for the kind of front and inner thigh. But the sculpt on the Lingjihun is covered in detail and has painted that circle of the hip in the dark silver colour as well. And it's a similar story all over the figure. They've also decaled it extremely well. It has all of the iconic markings, the 34, the white lines, the red lines. You can even see the detail of the emblem on the chest, unlike the NECA, which just had a red circle spot. And beyond that, it also has added some extra decals. Again, like around the chest, where it has these kind of strange little lines, like it's a ruler, is what it kind of reminds me of, with the same kind of decals on the fronts of the thighs. It has markings on the biceps, an extra white stripe on the forearm compared to the NECA. The knuckles and interior of the hand are all painted in the dark silver, unlike the NECA again, which is just one solid chunk of blue. It is, however, missing the caution tape style decals that are on the shins of the NECA. I can't find any clear images of the shins in the movie to see whether it's movie accurate. It should be, because the NECA Ultimate figure came out long after the film, so it's not like they would not know what it looks like. The head is also a huge improvement. It is actually really quite impressive. They've pretty much fully, properly done and replicated the visor, with a yellow piece with the right kind of sculpted detail, and then a clear plastic piece put on top of that to look pretty much just like the visor in the film. And they also did an excellent job with the black outline around it. You can even see on the sides of the head that the little trench has been painted basically perfectly in red, without any paint spill or anything. So you might be thinking, well, at least it's a good sculpt. They could always release a repaint later down the line like they've already done for the Crimson Typhoon. But another main aesthetic issue I have with the figure is the thighs, specifically the inner thighs. You can see most clearly, if I show you them from the bottom, that that's a big chunk of plastic there on the inside. One big, solid, plain, flat, undetailed hunk of plastic. And it just does not look good. And I don't just mean from the bottom, where you might think it doesn't matter too much, but even head on or looking from above. It makes the thighs very thick and end far too abruptly. And I just can't stop looking at it and noticing it. Compare with the NECA and you can see the difference in the thickness of the thigh. You can see if you also look down at the shins that the NECA overall is slightly thinner, but the thighs are too thick on the Lingjihun. And you can see on the NECA how they're supposed to look on the inside, where it's an armour panel coming down with a hollow space in between it and the knee joint. And also that it's not supposed to come out that far away from the knee joint. It's just a large chunk of plastic that just shouldn't be there. And unfortunately that's not all either. Right up prominently on the chest, those chest panels are far too thick. They stand out like a sore thumb. It's almost certainly because of the movement gimmick that they have, where if you move the arm, they move forward and back for some reason. It's not a detail I remember from the film, but it must be a thing because the Soul of Chogokin from Bandai also does the same. But it is not worth having these massive chunks of plastic right front and centre on the chest of the figure. I don't even have to compare it to the NECA, which does go the other direction and have them just pretty much completely flat, unlike they should be, because you can see on the Soul of Chogokin how they're supposed to look, and that's with the same kind of movement gimmick and everything. Of course it's at a much larger scale and a higher price point, but you can still see that they're not supposed to be this thick and also this angled. They've done raised panel lines on the edges of these here, when really, if anything, it should be, and would certainly look better, the opposite, beveled and smoothed off at the edge, rather than making the edge just even more prominent. And while I usually do it much later in the video, to finish up the disappointments, articulation. The head joint came very stiff and difficult to move, but has eventually loosened up from moving it for this review. It can look side to side a little, and it can actually look up as well, even though I originally had completely given up on it being able to do so, and it wasn't until I just accidentally got it to look up after accidentally loosening the joint up enough that I discovered it actually could look up. But it can't look down at all, which is kind of disappointing for something that's supposed to be this large and that you would probably want to be able to look down. It's pretty much because they just haven't cut out any space for it. Underneath the head is just one big flat surface for some reason that also just looks really quite ugly at any angle from above, especially in comparison with all the rest of the detail on the figure. The shoulders are attached on a ball joint, which is attached to the arm with a hinge so that you can completely lift them up and then also still wiggle them and everything, which allows the arm to come up a little bit past 90 degrees if you don't mind the shoulder looking pretty terrible and coming far too far away from the arm. There's no way they could have avoided that though, so better to have the range than not. No complaints. The joint itself under the shoulder though is a bit large and ugly, and providing less movement than if they had done the same as their Crimson Typhoon and just attached the arm into the body on a ball peg. Instead we have this ugly connection into the body that's rather large and doesn't move in any way except forward and back. And that's almost certainly for that chest panel movement gimmick, which is just absolutely not worth it. When I opened it and took the figure out of the box, that joint was extremely apparent. The shoulders weren't really hiding it at all. And I thought for sure that it must be a butterfly joint or something. I kept trying to move the shoulders forward there and get a butterfly motion, because the only thing it could look like to me is a hinge. And it's the only thing I could imagine being worth the strange large joint. But no extra movement except forward and back. If you raise the arm, you can also see that it has a big hole in it, like it's a plug for something. For some reason, it's not. I don't think anyway. I have no idea what it could be. Strange. The joint might at least be part of why it's able to go past 90 degrees, because it's not actually just one single hinge. It is actually two hinges, and so you can position the arm up or down while still being neutral. Then the biceps swivel, as they should, and the elbows get slightly under 90 degrees. Really the same as the NECA. The sculpt on Jaeger's does make it difficult to get past 90 degrees, but not very. You can see an example of how it could be done on the Soul of Chogokin. The wrist swivels and has a hinge. The hinge gets a lot of movement, so it overall might be worth the loss of movement from a ball joint or a ball hinge or anything. It's better than the basic ball joint that the original NECA figure had, but it's not as good as a ball hinge like you find on import figures and stuff, for example, where you would be able to get this same kind of range of movement, but in more directions, whatever direction you chose, and without being so long and large. The wrist joint on this is really quite noticeable. The top waist joint is a ball joint, even though I wouldn't know it if it hadn't popped off a couple of times, because it gets no movement except some slight swivel. Thankfully though, it has more movement at the waist, where you can move it a little bit back and slightly forward. Emphasis on slightly, however. I don't really see why they couldn't have just made that top joint a double ball peg and gotten more range of motion. It wouldn't have been any more expensive because the ball joint in there is already a separate piece, so it could have just been a double ball peg. The hips then come 90 degrees forward before colliding with the crotch, and backwards they go not at all. There is absolutely zero backwards movement. If you rotate the thigh and move the thigh armour out of the way, you can get some, and more the more you're willing to rotate and move the thigh out of the way. But absolutely none without doing that will compromise what you can do. Like I just said, there's thigh swivel as well as the leg being attached on a ball joint, so that swivels on 2 points. And as you can see, the actual thigh swivel is quite impressive. It's really quite nice. However, that is pretty much the same as the NECA. The NECA just chose to break up the detail between the two pieces in a different way, but certainly not as nice of a way, so still. The knees get just past 90 degrees. They're double jointed, but the top joint gets sub 90 degrees, and then the lower joint just doesn't really move or add as much as it could. And you can see on the NECA, its knee bends all the way. The NECA's knee joint is ugly from the front, but the joint on this isn't really much better. The top joint, while it does have a panel that pulls out and kind of hides the joint, it is just really flat and plain and matte, unlike the rest of the figure. And the lower joint, while it does have a piston in it, just extends too far from the knee and looks unnatural. I would rather just have a full bend with a generally more natural sculpt and design than a piston, even for as much as I do like pistons. The hips can come out and do the splits this far, the same as the NECA, but it's pretty unavoidable. It's just where the armour starts to collide with the crotch, and it is the same as the Crimson Typhoon, and it is just plenty. You won't need more than that. Jaegers don't do splits. Now, for the ankle. They go forward, if you can call it that, back, forward, back, forward. Very impressive. They basically don't move. The joint is on a detent and clicky, but there is only one click of movement in the ankles. There is a toe joint, however, at least, that can go a full 90 degrees, so at least forward you can kind of leverage that, even though it isn't ideally designed because it comes away from the foot quite far and will be a little awkward to pose. as well as, of course, just not being as tight as the ankle joint or having any detents in it at all. If this is going to be your real ankle joint, then why put detents in the joint that doesn't move and not this one? Pivot, yeah, same story. Almost non-existent. If you move the ankle forward that one click and push as hard as you can get some pivot out of it, but nowhere near enough, and certainly not naturally enough. It will hinder posing. Compared to the NECA, which actually has an ankle joint. Not an incredible one or anything, but it can move back, it can move forward, and it still has a toe joint. The NECA gets about the same amount of pivot, but it doesn't require the ankle to be forward in the same way or anything. So, going back over it and summarising, the places that are better than the decade-old, originally cheaper NECA figure are the shoulders, which can come out a lot further, the wrists, which can move in and out more, but not up and down at all, the waist, which can move back a little bit, although it does leave a gap, which is quite ugly, and so if you want to avoid that gap, the usable range of motion is far smaller. And that's it. And for those improvements, we get worse knees and slightly worse ankle. So, I certainly hope you can see why I'm disappointed by a new, modern, high-end release, barely competing with a decade or however old figure that was cheaper on its release. I do very much like that original NECA figure. It's been great, so it's not like the articulation on this is unworkable or completely dead or missing anything absolutely critical or anything, but there's no way this is as good as it should be. It does come with more accessories than the NECA though. It comes with 3 extra pairs of hands, 2 plasma cannon replacement forearms, as well as effect parts for them, which is really nice. Elbow rocket effect parts, which are, I think, my favourite accessory. I'm so glad to finally have a figure with these. The elbow rockets have always been just super cool. The baseball ship, as well as the shipping container knuckle dusters, and 2 chainsword replacement forearms, which is interesting, and unlike the NECA that just has 2 chainswords that can just plug into the forearms. The one thing it is missing compared to the NECA though is the chest blast effect. That is disappointing, but it's fine, it's not a very big deal, but I do wish it did come with it, mostly because it would probably have made them do the clear part for the chest better and similar to NECA's where it has to be recessed and everything in order to accommodate the effect part. And it is of course the exact same height as the NECA, that's why I've been comparing the two so much. And so if you want, it will fit in with any of your old NECA figures, or if you get this and want a lot more Jaegers, you could dip into the wider selection of the NECAs, especially the Kaiju, but Lingjihun has actually already announced that they're making a Kaiju figure, which is surprising. It's pretty great. It shows they're planning and intending on doing more than just the main 4 Jaegers anyway. If you're getting into the Kaiju, I feel like you would be willing to go deep into the Jaegers. And so really that's where my main hope lies. Out of all the Jaegers that could have been very disappointing, maybe counterintuitively, I am actually glad that it is the Gypsy Danger. I hope that whatever's next, Striker Eureka or Cherno Alpha, are much better and don't have these issues. Because Gypsy Danger at least, well, it's Gypsy Danger. If there was ever a Jaeger that might get a whole 2.0 completely new redone version, it's this one. In the meantime, at least, we can just hope for an exclusive version like the Crimson Typhoon. Ideally, preferably one that's not actually very exclusive, or even exclusive at all, please. That has a more dulled down and weathered and everything paint job, just to at least fix that complaint and issue. I wasn't sure whether I would customise one of the Crimson Typhoons in order to be the more kind of in-between level of weathering that I wanted, but with this, I think I will customise it at least a little, just because it is so lacking in weathering that I could even just at least dry brush and weather it to the same degree as their original Crimson Typhoon, and so I'd really only be adding a little bit and be fairly subtle and more properly and more thoroughly panel lining it and everything. But I would still certainly like a more thoroughly changed one with a different blue and everything. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like, subscribe, etc. It would be a huge help. And also let me know your favourite and least favourite figures of the year too. Or what your most disappointing figure is, if that's separate to your least favourite, like this probably is for me, because it's still a good figure, it's still nice, but just, yeah, boy is it not what I hoped for, and not what it could have been. Thank you very much for watching. Until hopefully next time, bye.